Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live in the studio with me today, I have Barry O'Neill. Barry is a lieutenant with the Memphis Fire Department. In addition, he holds a bachelor's degree in fire administration and is a paramedic. Barry has served as both a paid and volunteer firefighter and emergency medical services professional for over 25 years. And he's currently going through the Executive Fire Officer Program with the National Fire Academy. Barry, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, a lot of people I talk with have always dreamed about being a firefighter, and last week I had the opportunity to come out and actually tour the firehouse where you work. So thank you again for taking me on the tour. I'm going to post photos on my website for anybody who's interested to sort of check that out. But for those who've kind of dreamed of becoming a firefighter, can you talk a little bit about what it is that you do in your job as a lieutenant?
Well, as a lieutenant, I am in charge of a fire company, which is comprised of 4 other personnel, a driver, and 3 firefighters. And we respond to any call that we get from the public. The fire service in general across the country now really is termed as what we term as an all-hazard provider. If you call for service, if you call 911, the fire department's going to come. And it doesn't matter what your complaint is or what the problem is. It could be a fire, which is what most people think of, automobile accidents, medical calls, gas leaks, hazardous materials leaks. We respond to man-made and natural disasters. So any call for service we come to. What I do as a lieutenant is I'm responsible for the direction of those personnel that I have working for me to make that incident go away, make that life livable again for that person that called us for emergency assistance.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, I will say after touring the firehouse, I had a lot more respect for sort of what you're doing and also the extent of what you're doing. I was surprised when we took a walk around, in addition to the trucks, that you also had a boat.
Yes.
And I wasn't expecting a boat.
Yes. Again, an all-service provider. It doesn't matter the emergency. We are going to make an attempt to make it go away, and we try really hard to prepare ourselves to be ready for any event that comes about. People laugh at me a lot because I tend to be a, well, what if type of person. Well, you can what if any topic to death, but that's my job. That's my responsibility, is to think of those outrageous incidents, excuse me, and how I would have to fix those if somebody calls me to help with it.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, you have been working in the fire area for over 25 years. Can you talk a little bit about what got you initially interested?
Well, truthfully, it's the family business. My father was on the fire department. In fact, my father was a paramedic on the fire department and was one of the first paramedics in the state. My grandfather was on the fire department. He died in the line of duty in 1962.
Wow.
My uncle was on the job. My brother's on the job now. It's just the family business. But growing up in the fire station, I saw the family environment that was there, how the firefighters took care of each other, and also went out of their way to help the public. Kids would come in from the fire, into the fire station from the neighborhood and some of the fire stations my dad worked at. And the firefighters there would sit down at the table and help them with homework or feed them or give them a bath. There were kids that came in that were really underprivileged, and this is in the 70s and 80s, and it still goes on today. But and the firefighters there would take care of the kids in that neighborhood. If the kids got out of line, the firefighters would discipline their kids just like they were their own. And to me, that was really important to know that there were people out there who really cared about the community, and that's what the fire department or the firefighters in the fire station were all about. And I always wanted to be part of that.
Wow, that's really incredible. Do you remember at what point you kind of decided that you were going to be a firefighter? Do you remember about how old you were?
13 or 14. There was a really bad wreck in front of my house. And I lived on a busy street, so we saw them periodically. And I would see my dad go out and help whoever, if he was at home. Well, my dad was at the fire station, and there was a really bad wreck. I ran out, and when the fire department got there, they had to pull me out of the car because I was in the car trying to help this individual that was in there. And when they pulled me out and said, look, carry your young rear end back in the house, we've got this.
Right.
It made me decide, okay, I can do this, and this is what I want to do someday.
Oh, wow. That's really incredible. I mean, you could never forget that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's really incredible. Well, so one thing I found really interesting about your background is that you've kind of gone up through the ranks over the years, and you're continuing that now with the work that you're doing through the Executive Fire Officer Program,
Right.
Through the National Fire Academy. Can you talk a little bit about, in terms of like, where did the motivation come from to sort of do that and to grow in your career in that way?
Well, the fire service is a career path, or an industry, if you will, where you can really advance as far as you want as long as you're willing to put in the work and seek the education and seek the experience in doing that. It's hard in an environment like Memphis or any individual department, because as you get promoted through the ranks, the number of promotions narrows, like a lot of other industries. Well, the opportunity is to go to other places if you're willing to advance yourself through education and through experience. So hopefully in a couple of years, if the opportunity presents itself, and with this experience and this education I'm getting from the National Fire Academy, I'll be able to take that to other departments if the opportunity to promote in Memphis doesn't become available.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's very exciting. I think, I also learned from talking with you a lot about these different levels, because I think as just a general person in the public, I think of the firemen, and that's kind of it. I never sort of knew there was a hierarchy or that there were other pieces. So this has been really helpful. Well, I mentioned when I toured the fire station last week that I posted that I was going to be talking to you on Facebook, and I received a number of questions, and we went through a lot of them, but I just want to cover a couple of them with you.
Sure.
I was really excited to receive these. I think I probably received more positive response about this interview than probably any interview
It's good to know
that we've done. So the first question is from a woman who works for the Red Cross, and she wrote in first to say thank you for your service. She said, I'm amazed and saddened by the number of residential house fires our community experiences every single day. At the Red Cross, we respond to an average of about 3 per day. How many fires does the Memphis Fire Department respond to each day or each year?
Well, that's really very accurate. What we term a working fire, where we get to an emergency scene and we actually have to stretch hose and put water on a fire, it's about 3 a day. As of July of this year, our total calls for service, we were a little over 100,000. 70% of those, roughly 70% of those, were medical calls. But the numbers, in talking to some people in dispatch and our data analysts, those numbers are on track this year, and they're probably going to be well over 180,000 calls for service by the end of the year. Like I said, about 70% are medical calls, and the rest are fire calls of some nature, either an alarm of some sort from an automatic alarm, or an odor of smoke, or actual working fires. But the actual working fires are, like I said, about 3 a day.
Okay. Wow, that's quite a few. When we spoke before, you mentioned, or we talked a little bit about the difference between an emergency call and calls that you may get that are non-emergency calls that come in. If we're sort of in the moment and something's happening, how can we tell the difference between an emergency that's worth calling in an emergency versus something else?
That's really a question that's more difficult to answer than you would expect. The average person thinks of an emergency as any situation that should be resolved right now. Well, to me, an emergency is any situation where someone may die or lose a limb if I don't respond and act right now. As a responder, I hesitate to tell people not to call 911 because there are so many times when, especially if someone has a medical complaint, they may say, I have indigestion, when it turns out they're having a heart attack. And because they didn't call 911 to bother an ambulance, their heart attack gets much worse and they have a much worse outcome in the long run. What I would suggest is to someone who was considering whether or not to call 911 is to think for just a second, if I don't call 911 and get help right now, is somebody going to die? Or could someone die? If the answer is, well, no, not really, but I'm going to be really inconvenienced, then maybe you should call our non-emergency number, which is 458-8281, and ask for assistance then. We'll be happy to send out an inspector or a fire truck or whoever needs to come to help you with your problem. But we won't come with lights and sirens and put the public at risk because we're going through intersections and speeding on the street. That's or using speeds that are higher than the average posted speed limits, in a rush to get to help you. But we will come and we will provide whatever service you need. So we're always there for you. It's just a matter of whether or not you call 911 or you call our non-emergency number.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm sure for our listeners who are in other cities and other states and things, I'm sure their fire department or their, there are other non-emergency numbers.
Absolutely. And it'll be up to the individual and where they live to make that call. That number that I gave is strictly for the city of Memphis.
Sure.
Other departments, fire departments in the county have their own non-emergency numbers.
Oh, interesting.
So they're easily accessible through the internet, through a quick Google search, if you will, or if you still have an old phone book, the old blue pages and the old phone books. I don't think anybody has those anymore. I haven't seen one in years. So
yeah, I use them as a doorstop, I think, typically.
That works too.
Well, I would be curious if you could share with us a little bit about the difference between being a volunteer firefighter and being a paid firefighter. Is there a difference, and what is it? There
is, and the biggest difference is how much you get paid every other week. Volunteer firefighters, the common stereotype is they're the good old boy in the neighborhood that likes to hang out in the fire station and just make it a social type event or a social activity to be a volunteer firefighter. But in today's world, that's really not the case. In Tennessee, for example, volunteer firefighters have to be certified. Their fire department has to be certified and endorsed by the state. Well, to become certified, you have to go through a minimum of 200 hours of training. Volunteers will go 1 or 2 days a week for however many weeks it takes to get that minimum training to their local fire station or to the State Fire Academy I think it's in Bell Buckle, Tennessee, to get that initial training and then get their certification and go on from there. Well, they have to do that on their vacation time, on their days off, time that they take away from their family, in addition to doing their regular job. Paid firefighters, I do that all on duty. That's part of my job. That's what I go do. All our training is here in Memphis. But that's the biggest difference. That and the fact that if at 3 o'clock in the morning I get a call for service, I'm not going to wake my wife up or my kids up when I get in the fire truck and leave. But if I'm a volunteer firefighter, I get the call at home, I get in my car, I go to the fire station or go directly to whatever the emergency is and meet the other firefighters there to take care of the job.
Wow. So it sounds like they're being held to a very similar standard.
Very similar.
But it probably inconveniences their own personal life much more.
It does. But like I said earlier about the rewards of being a firefighter and being able to help the community, those volunteers that do that, and I tip my hat to them, those that are still volunteers today, that it takes a lot of commitment and it takes time away from the family, but they really do a very good thing for their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so I received another question from another listener who was interested in terms of, applying to work in the fire department. And the question says, I've heard there's an age limit for new recruits. Is that true? And are there any other recruitment restrictions?
There is an age limit in Memphis. The minimum age is 21 and the maximum age is 35. Different fire departments around the country have different age requirements. I've never heard. Well, no, I take that back. There are departments that will take teenage, trainees. They call them explorers, or they call them junior firefighters. They're different things. But I've even seen high school programs in different cities around the country where they'll train high school kids to start that initial certification process, kind of as a career counseling or as a career development type program.
Yeah.
And they'll get some that'll end up being volunteers, or they'll end up being firefighters, or go on, paid firefighters, or they'll go into other professions. But in Memphis, the minimum age is 21 and then the maximum age is 35.
That's interesting. So when you see the people who are in high school, is that ever spearheaded by the Boy Scouts, or is that it's unrelated?
The Scouts had, through the Explorer Scout program, had a lot of influence in that for a
Right.
long time. I think there was a lot of that came from California,
Okay.
in Southern California in particular, through the Explorer Scouts program. It's just kind of spread throughout the country. But there are other cities who have gone directly into the schools. Detroit, Buffalo, and I can't remember the city in Georgia that did it, but they have an actual high school program that it's at the VOTEC school, and they have a class, and they, instead of taking wood shop for their VOTEC training, they go to firefighting classes. They come out of high school with a firefighter certification and I believe an EMT certification in the program in Buffalo, but I don't remember for sure. It's been a while
That's
since I
so
looked
interesting. So we talked about this briefly when I came out to the firehouse, but are all firefighters EMTs? Is that
All firefighters that we hire now have to be a minimum of EMT.
okay?
We have to have a specific number of paramedics in order to provide the level of service that we've committed to. And so firefighters that are hired now at a minimum have to be EMTs, but the fire department reserves the right to, at some point, to say, look, we need more paramedics. We need you to go to paramedic training and become a paramedic too. But we did have a brief time period where everyone we hired went all the way through paramedic school.
Yeah,
all the way through
absolutely.
paramedic certification.
That's interesting. So I'm curious, in Memphis in general, how many firefighters are there?
We have about 1,600 uniformed firefighters for the city of Memphis. Roughly 400 of those are paramedics, which
Okay.
is the highest level of medical care that we provide. And then the vast majority of the rest are emergency medical technicians, which is an entry level in pre-hospital medicine.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, and at your particular station, how many firefighters are there?
There are, you asked me the other day, and I had to stop and think about it. There are 7 on the engine, 5 on the rescue truck, so there are 13 there total. I have to have a minimum of 10 in the firehouse for all of the response equipment to be fully staffed and be able to respond to emergencies. But we have 3 extra that are assigned there or could be assigned there to fill in for vacation time or for if someone's off sick, just
That's
so make sure that
interesting.
we have enough staffing at all times.
And it sounds like when the firefighter comes in and they're on duty, it's for long periods of time.
It is. We work 24-hour shifts. We work an average of 56 hours a week, either 2 or 3 24-hour shifts a week. And it's a rotating schedule. So I'll work 3 24-hour shifts with a day off between each shift. And after the third shift, I'll have 4 days off.
Yeah, that's just wild.
So, well, it can be. And it can be hard on us sometimes on those days that are really, really busy, that we're up for 18, 20, 24 hours during the shift. But most days, we'll have enough downtime that we'll be able to sit down and we'll eat together, or we'll sit down and rest, or, we'll have other, we'll work out in our exercise area, or, what have you, to kind of pass the day.
Yeah.
But in the long run, it's a better schedule, not only for us because we get more time off to rehabilitate and to spend time with our families, but also because it's more cost effective for the city to have us on 24-hour shifts, because that way we can staff the city with fewer firefighters and have the same coverage, and versus having 3 8-hour shifts.
That's so interesting. When you talk about it that way, it sounds so much more like a business and a job than the way that we often, I think, picture it in our minds.
It's strange. When I was younger, I heard people say that government and the fire service should be run like a business. And that to me was just so shockingly foreign. It's like, how could you even think of a fire department being run like a business? We don't do anything like any normal business. Well, as I get more experience in the fire service and more education in the fire service, I realize, well, actually, no, there's a lot of truth to that. We have to be financially responsible to the people that pay our salaries and pay our budget, to the taxpayer. We have to give them the best service possible at the most, or in the most economical means possible. And that's one thing that the fire department's really tried hard to do over the last especially the last few years since the last great recession, I think is what it's commonly referred to really try to make the dollars that we do get stretch as far as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So if we're listening today and we're interested to become a firefighter, like we've always dreamed of this and we've just never done it, where should we begin?
Well, first start in your local fire department. Go if you live in a smaller community and you have a volunteer fire department that serves your community, go knock on their door. They're usually there sometime. A lot of times during the day there'll be one or two people there, or they may be there in the evenings for training meetings. Go knock on their door. Go to your local government if you live in a larger community. Most government websites, Memphis does in particular, in their in the various departments within the city, they'll have a link to their human resources. Go there and look and see if there are job openings and see if there's availability for employment. The biggest thing, though, that I would say to someone who wants to be a firefighter is don't just look in your own community. Be willing to look in other cities. Be willing to look in other places. When I got hired in the Memphis Fire Department, I had applications in Denver, Charlotte, Atlanta, and then shortly after, I put in applications in other cities too. But the Memphis Fire Department turned out to be the best fit for me, so I decided to stay here. But look in other places. And when you go to a fire department, especially a paid department, you'll be expected to take a test because it's a very competitive process. You'll be expected to take an agility test to make sure that you're physically capable of performing the tasks of a firefighter. And then a lot of times there'll be some sort of written test to make sure that you have some mechanical ability, that you're able to read, that you can perform mathematics and simple functions that you have to do the job. Test in different cities. Don't just test in one place. Go to different cities. Keep looking. If you get hired, say in Memphis, but in 6 months, Nashville gives you a call and says, "Hey, we've got a job opening here. If you'd rather work in Nashville, work that way." But if you really want a career in the fire service, don't just look in your hometown. Look all over.
That's interesting. So, when someone's preparing to take the agility test or the written test, and by agility, I think you mean like a physical
fitness type test, yes.
Especially for the written part of the test, are there resources online that people could look for?
Absolutely. There, any local library or online, Google, Amazon.com, there are a lot of preparation materials that are out there that are available. Exercise books to give you exercises and give you fitness programs to help gear you up for the agility test. There are practice exams for civil service tests or for firefighter-based tests from a bunch of different publishers. Penwell Publishing is one big one. They produce Fire Engineering magazine and then a number of different fire service textbooks. IFSTA is IFSTA, the International Fire Service Training Association, produces firefighting textbooks, and they produce testing materials and practice materials for entrance exams and then all of the other advanced exams that firefighters take for various certifications. So there are a lot of resources out there that are easily available.
Interesting. So the agility test, is it similar to what someone might experience when they were joining the military? Is it very different?
It is. It's different, but it's the same. Most military basic fitness tests, they test your body strength and they test your endurance by doing an X number of a specific exercise and running a certain distance in a specific time. Well, most firefighter agility tests are task oriented. For example, in Memphis, we use the candidate physical agility test that's been approved by or is designed by the International Association of Fire Chiefs and the International Association of Firefighters, and then was approved by the Department of Justice as being one that was close enough to what we do in the job that it was reasonable for people, for both males and females, to be able to complete in the required times. It starts out with a stair climb, wearing a weighted vest, carrying weights on your shoulders as if you were climbing up a high-rise building, carrying hose and wearing all your gear. There's a ladder raising portion where you have to raise a ladder onto a building and then extend it to its full extension. You have to drag hose a certain distance. You have to crawl through a maze that's darkened and that you can't see in. So there are a number of tasks in that are very similar to what we do in the fire service, all requiring endurance levels, to be higher than average, and all of them or most of them requiring upper body strength to be a little higher than average. So if someone was preparing for that, I would definitely say go to your local gym and get on a stair mill and spend some time on a stair mill or on a Stairmaster and do a lot of exercises to increase your upper body strength, push-ups, pull-ups, things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the things this kind of leads me to think about is, veterans.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit. I often will work with people who are coming out of the military and they're transitioning into civilian jobs.
Mm-hmm.
How often do you see veterans coming in and applying to work at the fire department?
We see quite a number. In Memphis, veterans don't necessarily get preference points in hiring, but veterans tend to do much better in the agility test and tend to do better in the written tests that we provide, because many of the written requirements and are very similar to what the written requirements that they have in the military, and because they're coming right out of the military, they usually tend to be a little more fit than the average applicant off the street. There are communities in the country, though, that have preference points. They'll have a point system for new applicants. In Massachusetts, for example, there's one civil service test. But if you're a veteran, or especially if you're a combat veteran, you get bonus points when you take that test. So there are a lot of communities where veterans get preferential hiring. And like I said, they tend to do very well in the fire service. They tend to fit into the fire station very well when they do get on the job, but they don't necessarily get preference points here in the city.
Yeah, and it sounded like, the hierarchy idea is somewhat similar to the military.
Exactly. That is one thing about the fire service. There is a very specific rank structure. You come in as a firefighter. In Memphis, we call firefighters entry-level firefighters, we call them privates.
Okay.
When you get promoted to an officer position, you become a lieutenant and then a chief, and there are various levels of chief. And just like in the military, there's a rank structure that you follow. If one of my firefighters has a request, hey, I want to take a day off, well, he has to come to me for approval. I take it to my chief for approval, and it goes up the chain of command before it's finalized. It's not like that is one way that it really differs from a business where anyone in the office can go knock on the boss's door and say, hey, I'd like this day off, and the boss can say yes or no. Well, here, in the fire service, there's a chain of command that has to be approved and go through that. And that's the same and for days off or for any menial task, but especially on the fire scene. If we do go to an emergency and I'm looking at this emergency scene and there's a job that needs to be done, I have to be able to tell my firefighters, perform this task, perform that task, get this done. Well, it's not a time for debate. It's not a time for discussion. It's a time for them to follow orders and get the job done. And that's one reason that people with military experience really handle that well, because they're used to that.
Right.
They've been in that experience in that situation in the past, and so it's not an issue for them. Sometimes young people that get hired that have never had that experience, they'll stop and question, well, why are we doing that? Well, an emergency scene, I don't have time to explain it. I'll be happy to explain it any other time during training or sitting at the coffee table in the evening. But at the emergency scene, I expect it to get done right that second. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so one other question that I got from someone on Facebook was with regards to technology and how technology has changed your job over the last, say, 25 years.
Tremendously. For example, when I came on the fire department as a paramedic, we used an EKG machine that was a very simple box. It looked at electrical activity in the heart from one specific angle, and then gave me electricity to defibrillate somebody in the event that they had a heart problem that needed electricity to be fixed. Well, today, defibrillators aren't just power sources. They can do anything that you can see done in an emergency room. Highly sophisticated examinations of the heart, of electrocardiograms. They can look at and analyze blood gases. They can check your blood pressure. They can do a number of different things that increases the level of care and speeds the advanced care that someone who's having a very serious medical emergency needs to get better. It starts right at the bedside in their own home rather than waiting 3, 5, 10, 15 minutes till they get to the emergency room. In the fire service, on the firefighting side, for example, we now use thermal imaging cameras where at one time you only saw those in helicopters or in military applications, but I can use a thermal imaging camera to go in a building that's completely blackened with smoke and see just like looking at a video screen. This screen's a little bit different. It takes some getting used to. But I can move through a building now with relative ease, whereas 20 years ago, if I was going to go in a building that was blackened with smoke, it was on my hands and knees, and it was touching a wall and feeling my way through, because even a flashlight wasn't going to help me get through the building.
Right.
So there's been a huge amount of improvement in the job that we do just on technology.
What about GPS? 20 years ago, I'm assuming, did you have to have a better idea of where something was located versus now you have GPS?
GPS helps us in locating incidents on a grander scheme. Every piece of fire equipment in the city, every vehicle, emergency response vehicle, has a computer in it, and that computer is tied into a GPS system. So for mapping purposes, for responding to emergencies and finding out what an emergency is, that has come along a long way and really helps us a lot.
Right.
But as far as going into a particular building, just because of the technology of GPS and because it's satellite-based, there still hasn't been enough development to where it works for us inside a building, even though there are a couple of different universities. Loyola is working on a system using GPS to help firefighters locate themselves within a building. And there's another school, Worcester, Massachusetts, I think, Worcester Tech. There's a program there where they're working on things to use a GPS type system for firefighters to keep them from getting lost in buildings.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Well, initially we met because you reached out to me after you saw an interview that I did on a local station here in Memphis on television that was with regards to stress, workplace stress. And we were talking about a study that was done between Harvard and Stanford. And essentially the study found that workplace stress is as bad for your health as secondhand cigarette smoke. So you reached out to me, and I understand you're doing some research that's somewhat related. Can you talk a little bit about your research?
Sure. My research specifically is regarding sleep and firefighter fatigue. Annually, firefighters are killed in the line of duty, are killed in that course of their jobs at the rate of about 100 per year. Well, the research is borne out, and statistics have shown over the last 30 years that over half of those have been from stress-related injuries, either cardiac-related injuries or heat-related injuries. Well, as a fire service, we've tried harder to improve the health of our firefighters, but we still have a long way to go with that. And when I sat down to look at research that I could do for this research project for the National Fire Academy, I looked at doing things related to health for firefighters. And in order to narrow it down to something that we could do in Memphis, I looked at sleep patterns in the Memphis Fire Department and firefighters here. We've had some changes in our station alerting system and how our tones go out and how we're alerted to calls. I've noticed that in a lot of fire stations, if you go in the bed hall in the middle of the night, it's really not common or not uncommon at all to have 4 or 5 firefighters that are sleeping and are snoring pretty loudly. And I know that I have sleep apnea, I have snoring issues, and I thought, well, if I have these problems and I'm having these issues, then there's probably a bigger picture that needs to be looked at and how firefighters are sleeping and how rested they are and what impact that's having on their health, and then in the long run on how they're performing their duties.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting kind of walking around and seeing all those beds to think about the fact that people are really in there sleeping.
Right. It's traditionally firefighter dormitories have been large open rooms with a lot of beds in, and all the firefighters go in there and sleep. More modern fire stations have individual dormitories, individual sleeping areas for firefighters, but it costs a lot of money to refit all those old buildings to do that. Well, hopefully in some of this research I can maybe get an idea of what the cost is for not making sure that firefighters are getting the rest that they need, and see if that cost, with an initial investment of speeding up the modernization of sleeping quarters, can help with that long-term health costs associated with not getting enough rest and not being able to take care of ourselves properly. So it's just one of the different things that I'm looking at, but it is something that I'm thinking about and hoping I'll shed some light with this research.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So how are you going about actually doing the research?
Well, the first thing I did was look at different research and different papers from around the country. And what I found was there were a lot of research about sleep deprivation. There was a lot of research regarding shift work and the impact that it had on the average worker, but there wasn't much specifically related to firefighters. In fact, of 3 or 4 research projects I found, most were outside the country. One was in Tehran, one was in Korea, one was in Japan, and only 1 or 2 that were actually inside the United States. So I looked at that and then I decided, well, I need to compare that to other industry. So I'm looking at transportation industry. I'm looking at healthcare and some of the rules that the federal government has put out and some of the major governing organizations that have put out in that specific industry, or in those specific industries related to sleep. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to compare what we do to those industries. What I'm also doing is I sent out a research questionnaire to all the firefighters on the fire department here in Memphis, asking them how they feel, if they feel fatigued, mm-hmm. And then having them rate their fatigue using some accepted questionnaires that physicians use to help determine whether or not someone has a fatigue problem. Mm-hmm. And then also trying to break it down by job classification and where they work and how busy they are, so I can compare those different numbers and those different demographics to get an idea of how tired we are as a fire service.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting. It sounds like you've actually gotten a number of responses already. I have.
Out of 1,600 firefighters, the last time I checked, it was almost 300 that have responded to me. Hopefully I'll get another 100 or so mm-hmm. between now and Christmas, so that I'll feel more confident in the numbers that I produce, or the numbers that the research produces when I do put my paper together for submission to the Fire Academy.
Yeah, that's exciting. So when will you put that paper together? Do you?
It is due the first week in February. Hopefully, I'll have it completed by right after Christmas or the first week in January. I'll have it all done, and I'll be in the mm-hmm. review process and the editing and having someone proofread and what have you. So,
yeah.
And that way it's all done, and I hope to have it turned in by no later than the third week in January.
Oh, that's exciting. Well, I look forward to kind of hearing about those results.
I'll be happy once I get my grade back to share it. I certainly am not going to pass it out to anybody if I don't get the grade that I want. But.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you're working really hard on it. Well, so we've covered a ton of different topics all mm-hmm. over with the fire department. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us?
I do. I would absolutely be remiss as a firefighter if I didn't take the opportunity to remind folks the time to change your clocks is coming soon. Well, fire departments across the country are trying to remind the people of America that when you change your clocks, you should change the batteries in your smoke detector. Mm-hmm. You should take the time then to make sure that they work. You should take the time to make sure that you have one in every sleeping area in the house and on every floor in the house if you live on a two-story house or higher, and to make sure that you take care and have good fire safety in your own home. But the biggest thing is make sure you change your batteries. The time's coming, and go get a 9-volt battery, put it in. It takes about 10 minutes, and we don't want to go to another fire where there's a smoke detector on the wall with no battery and someone had a bad outcome because of that.
Oh, man. Well, that's great advice. I know I feel like I'm already going to go home and look things over to try to be sure. Well, first of all, Barry, thank you for your service.
My pleasure.
It was incredible to go out and to see what you do in person. It gave me a really different perspective on the fire department and fire safety in general.
Well, we were glad to have you and glad to kind of shed light on what we do, and you're welcome to come back anytime.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks also for coming in today to do this podcast. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher so you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.